Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that. Do you want to
Right.
check that it moves on?
Yeah, there we are. It is. It was something
Yeah,
about it being stuck because I'd already got it in slideshow mode.
yeah, that's perfect.
So yes, so my aims and objectives. So giving you some information about what we do at Relate and some of the issues that we see young people coming forward with and what to be aware of when you're in your dealings with young people, really, how you can help, and as I say, some sort of useful resources. At Relate, we, as I say, one of our services is the young person's counselling, which is the age range 11 to 25. And that's really that people who are trained will sort of go through, will work in that age range as opposed to adults. So when you get people in their 20s, sometimes they might come for individual adult counselling, but sometimes they might come for young people's counselling. It's a bit of a sort of crossover, really. But often in the past, when there was more funding available, the funding would often give people funding up to 25. So it was easier for people to access, free counselling up to that age. We offer counselling in our centres, and that's also virtual centres because we do a lot on Zoom these days. And obviously that's through a sort of self-referral route. Obviously with the younger end, 11, 12, 13, it's usually parents who are referring them and making the appointments. But sometimes with the older end, we do get people who, young people who refer themselves. We also have quite a lot of contracts in schools and colleges. And like I said, I used to work on one that we had in Taunton's College where they, had a contract with the local Southampton Relate Centre for someone to deliver counselling in their at their venue. I just sort of put in about family counselling because that's also something where with this age range, it can sometimes be useful because there's a crossover, there's a lot going on in the family that's often affecting the young people and vice versa, really. So that's another aspect of work we offer, which might be helpful for young people. And certainly I was thinking about quite often that, part of your core thing about people moving on to further education. Sometimes if you've got a family where there is no sort of history of anybody doing that and it's not what the family ethos is, and a young person is sort of breaking the mold, so to speak, sometimes that can feel quite threatening in a family. And so maybe something like being able to talk about that together could be quite helpful in a family situation. The presenting issues that young people bring in when they come for counselling. It's probably not an exhaustive list. Sort of identity, sexuality, bullying, anxiety, relationship issues, trauma, concerns about their study, and anxiety about the future. Those are obviously ones that, link in with what we're talking about today. There's lots of things, and often I think I've found, especially when working on a contract, when you're in a sort of somewhere like a college setting, that you often get a lot of referrals from the staff or whatever the system is in the place you're working. And you might get a referral that says, oh, you need to see this person, they need to come for counselling because X and Y has happened. And then when they actually come along, that isn't what they want to talk about at all. There's something quite different that's going on for them. And so what they may have presented at the first session is something quite different underneath. And I think that's one of the things with young people, that it takes quite a long time often to build up the relationship with them, for them perhaps to trust to tell you what the real problems that are going on for them are. What we don't work with, sort of specialism. So I suppose it's often a very difficult thing to explain or difficult thing to know where the borderline is, because we're not specialists in sort of self-harm or addictions or mental health conditions. But that doesn't mean that we don't have clients who aren't coming to us who aren't self-harming, who might have mental health conditions. And I think the thing there for us is that we can't cure that. What we will be working with them is helping them to talk about that, helping them to identify what strategies they have, where it started, and what other help they needed. Actively suicidal clients, again, that's going to need some sort of much more mental health input or CAMS input from the child and adolescent mental health services. And I'm sure you all know that they're really well stretched, and that's actually something that we get a lot of referrals coming to us from people saying, we've had an assessment at CAMS, but there's a 2-year waiting list, so can we come to you in the meantime? And it's a really tricky one, because I think for some people that's really useful and it can be helpful. For other people, there can be sometimes a sort of, well, we're seeing someone that relates, so we don't need to, you know, hurry up the CAMS thing, and we're not the right people. So I think in cases like that, we always will do an assessment and sort of be quite clear about what we can work with, and also be quite clear if we don't feel we can. And we'll often try and support people by, you know, writing ourselves to the doctor or CAMS and saying this person needs seeing more urgently, etc. When it's not the young person's agenda or wish to come to counselling, and as I say, I think sometimes parents, you know, teachers, people who are around those young people often think that they need to have some counselling, but they don't want to. And I think, you know, you can't force somebody to have counselling. It has to be the right time for them. And I think if you do, you know, force an issue like that, it can actually put somebody off it for life, probably. So I think it's always a balance. Again, I think I've often done assessments, and sometimes a young person has said, actually, you're all right, really, I'll come back and see you next week. But if they've said, I don't want to come back, you know, I don't want to talk about this, then I would sort of say, well, that's up to you, and see how you feel, and you can always come back, but maybe now isn't the right time. So yeah, as I said at the end, you know, we will do an assessment, and we'll try and refer a signpost elsewhere, really, if we can't help. So moving on to sort of more focused on, you know, not just what we do at Relate, but how we can all support young people. I think we all know that the teenage years are quite a time of a lot of turmoil. And in recent years, certainly advances in understanding of brains in general and teenage brains helps us to realise that they're quite different and special. And it's the time, isn't it, when they're going through all that stuff in their development, but also it's quite a challenging time for making big decisions about the future, and having quite a lot of pressure put on them, probably, for, you know, to make decisions, to work hard at school, to behave themselves. And you know, they're pushing the boundaries, and they're going through that developmental stage, which is the teenage years that, you know, we've all been through too. So all those things sort of can add to anxiety and worry. And we do know that obviously trying to help them and support them can help them progress and fulfill their potential much more. I think one of the things that I remember from working in the college was that often when you're a teacher and you're having them in the room and they're, you know, acting out in class, or they're not doing their assignments, or they're not turning up for lessons, etc. You know, those can be quite frustrating ways that they're showing that they're unhappy and need help. And it's quite difficult to engage with that, because there's a lot of stuff going on that isn't very helpful, and they're not really showing you what the real problem is, or coming and talking about that. So I think those things probably fairly obvious to you here, you know, behavior changes, disengagement, anxiety, panic attacks, and they may talk about issues that aren't the real problem, you know, talk around other things that isn't really what's bothering them. Just a few statistics here, really, about an Action for Children report recently that found the top 4 worries that young people had were pressure from school, climate change, appearance, and then mental health. And I thought this was quite interesting, with quite a lot of young people feeling that their problem is not bad enough. And I think that if they find it difficult to talk about what's going on, or they're not getting support at home for that, they can often be feeling a lot of difficult feelings, but not feeling that they actually are worthy of anyone's concern, that they're not a big enough problem. And so they can bottle that up and not share that. So I was going to talk a bit about my experience of my counselling in a sixth form college, because that felt quite relevant really to this. So I think probably the big things that often used to come up for me was no support from family, and they were sort of not helped at all. Their family situation meant that they had quite a difficult home life and quite a lot put on them, maybe being a carer, maybe helping with siblings, being expected to be sort of the grown up, the older child, and have a job as well as do their study, etc. And so that was often quite a big thing that happened. And in little ways as well, that I remember there being quite a few people who would travel quite a long way to get to college, and it was quite difficult for them to access the public transport sometimes, but there was no one to give them a lift to the station or to drop them at the bus stop or whatever. So the support can be practical but also emotional, really. And I think a lack of that is really difficult for young people when they're struggling with a lot of things at that age and trying to find a way forward. And with that sometimes goes expectation. I think that lack of expectation, if you're in a family environment where actually there isn't any support for you to be doing further studies or to be thinking about going to university, that seems to be something that's financially out of reach in that family, but also it's just something they don't see as part of their world. And so that can be quite hard when young people have teachers and staff at school who are expecting something of them and who think they have got a lot of potential to fulfill, but the rest of their life outside of that classroom environment is people not giving them that encouragement or expectation. I think I had quite a lot of referrals when after exam times. I used to get a lot of referrals when people hadn't done very well in their exams and their mocks or whatever, and they would be sent along to me, and that would be the thing, and they would tell me sometimes what was going on in their lives, or they would talk about difficult things, such as having a parent who was an alcoholic, and quite difficult situations they were dealing with. But they didn't want to tell anyone else. They didn't want anyone to know about that. They didn't want anybody in the college to know. And I think I had quite a fortunate position in being someone who went in to work there one morning a week and I wasn't part of the college structure. So I think, and I remember, on several occasions sort of saying, well, I think it'd be really helpful if you could talk to your tutor about what's really going on. And they were like, no, I don't want them to know. And I think some of that will be worry that everybody will hear, that it won't be kept confidential. And another thing is probably shame as well, and a protectiveness about the family environment and the situation that's going on. And certainly in some families that will be vocalized. The family will know that there are things they don't want shared outside, and they will be sharing that and saying, don't talk to anyone about this. So that's often quite a hard thing to overcome, really, if that's the situation. And they may often have been quite behind with their work, and their poor attendance and things would be due to some of those issues. So I remember once seeing a girl whose mother had made a suicide attempt, and that had caused her to be off a lot, but she didn't want to share that. She didn't want anyone to know about that. She was very protective of her mother, and it was really tricky. So I suppose the message there is, I'm not sure we can solve that problem, but it is about taking time to build their trust and them really feeling that they are able to share some of those personal things. But that's where it can be useful. And and sometimes I was able to have situations where the tutor didn't know what was going on, but the student would say to me, you can tell them that I've got a lot of difficult things going on at home, and they'll believe you, sort of thing. So so it is a difficult thing, because obviously you can only work with what you know and what's being told to you. But I suppose it's that there's a lot going on often under the surface. So when you are in those positions to help, to have those conversations, to when you've spotted somebody who you think isn't really fulfilling their potential, and there may be some other things going on, is that sort of non-judgmental approach, really, you know, curiosity, you know, I'm wondering what's happening, because I think as soon as they feel they're in trouble or they're being monitored in some way or they're put on report, then they clam up and become quite defensive. Communication, so giving that opportunity for them to have the communication, you know, time when they might feel, you know that they can approach somebody, or they might find a teacher or a member of staff somewhere that they can talk to. I think respecting their, you know, their situation and their autonomy and about things. As I say, curiosity, interest, you know, asking those questions in a sort of curious way is one of those sort of arts. But, you know, I'm wondering if, and I've noticed that, and, you know, would you like to talk about anything, or, you know, have you got anyone to talk to about any issues that might be worrying you? Who do you talk to? You know, what support are you getting at home, etc. And so I suppose proceeding mindfully really is one of the things that I would say is key. You know, just, you know, maybe asking something, pulling back and seeing how things go forward. But never underestimate the importance of a listening ear. I think it's easy to feel, especially with young people at that stage of life, and when I talked a bit at the beginning about family counselling, I think it's quite easy to feel quite frustrated sometimes, especially if you hear things, you know, well, I haven't had a chance to do that because, or we don't have a computer at home, or, you know, I didn't get a lift to the bus stop because my parents were hungover, so I missed the bus to college, or whatever those things are. It's really difficult when you know that you practically can't do anything. And, you know, I often used to think, if only I could just take them home and sort this out. But actually, knowing that someone is listening to them is, you know, is an important thing and makes them feel heard, really, and understood. But I think it is that fact that often that is all you can do. You can't actually make the changes. And sometimes some of the conversation I had in the counselling room with young people at that sort of age of 16, 17 was around, you know, actually, if you do well now, if you work hard, if you do your best and you go to university, then actually that's you moving on and away from this difficult family situation. And you know, you will then be more independent, and that's what you actually want. And so, you know, how can we make that happen? How can we ensure that you don't miss this opportunity? Use of basic counselling skills. So I would always recommend to people, a lot of people over the years at Relate, we used to run a basic counselling skills course, which is what it is, quite a brief intervention into basic counselling skills. And I know when I was doing it in Portsmouth, which must be about 15 years ago, we sometimes had members of staff from schools coming and being sent on the course, you know, for different reasons. And I think people found that really useful. So, you know, if it's something that you are interested in, I would say recommend doing that. I think there's quite a lot online. There's quite a lot locally at local colleges and things, which are usually just a sort of terms. Basic counselling skills are level 3. So it's not, you know, such an investment. It's not going on a counselling training course and doing lots of assignments. It's much more practically based. So that might be something you want to look into to help you if you feel that would be a good way forward. And yeah, recognising that it takes time to gain trust from young people, which I'm sure you know. So recognising serious issues. So I think then we move into that more sort of safeguarding area, don't we? Where, you know, you may sort of feel there's something like addiction or an eating disorder or serious self-harm or suicidal ideation. So, you know, obviously those are things that I'm sure you all have the processes in place for escalating things like that to the safeguarding lead to sort of ensure the safety of the young person. So that's, you know, I would say that's something that often when things have got to that stage, there's probably going to need to be a fair, you know, more like a CAMHS or GP intervention really. When might counselling help, and also what modality? So again, if you're talking to people, to young people, and you know you're thinking that they might want to access some counselling, it's probably useful to know what's out there and what might be good for them to access. So, I mean, a lot of what we do at Relate and a lot of sort of counselling is about talking therapy, person-centred approach. So, you know, that traditional thing of, you know, why are you here? What would you like to get out of it? What's worrying you? Certainly most young persons counsellors are trained, well, all young persons counsellors are trained in that specific area. So there is more around using sort of interventions. You know, I guess when you do children's work, you're doing a lot of play and a lot of interventions, but some of that goes into the young person's work of you know, using things like getting them to draw, getting them to play games, getting them to do different things that we might have at our fingertips, so that it's not just they're sitting there looking at someone, it's sort of helping them to explore things. So I mean, you might be doing something like a geneagram, which is a sort of family tree with somebody, but you might get them to do that, so using some of their colouring techniques to colour in different colours for different family members and what that might mean, and getting them to sort of think about you know, the relationships in the wider family. Just, you know, things like that can be helpful to sort of take the absolute sort of one-on-one thing off it, which young people can find quite difficult sometimes. Cognitive behaviour therapy, CBT as people often know it, that's something that's usually sort of available. I mean, obviously there are private therapists who do it, but that's often the way that the NHS, if people get NHS referrals through their GP, it will often be a CBT approach. And that's used often for phobias, for things like OCD and things. And so it's much more, as it says, a sort of approach that uses your behaviour. So for instance, if you were you know, had OCD and you were washing your hands a lot, then some of the approach of that might be about how you can you know, stop doing that as much, how you can cut that down from 10 times to 5 times, and you know, your thought patterns around it, and what you're thinking when you feel compelled to do something, and then looking at what that is. So it's a bit more structured really than just the talking. There's some sort of behavioural, changing the behaviour elements to it really. Group support is something that is quite often offered to young people. I think there was a move a few years ago for CAMHS to, and I think part of it is you know, resources and money to offer groups for certain things. So they might have group support for people who have eating disorders. Again, for some people it can be really useful and really helpful, and they benefit from having others around them suffering from the same issues and feeling supported by that. For other people, it can be just absolute terror, the thought of having to discuss with someone, you know, in a room of other people, what's going on for them. So I think it's very much a personal thing for people. And online apps. So there are plenty of online apps around that offer support, you know, like in the way of web chat and texting chat and things like that. And so for some people, that's quite a useful sort of way to access it. I think we find more and more that obviously young people, that is how they live their lives, on their phones and things. So it is to them a really, you know, easy and good way to engage in some support. So I've sort of listed some of these here, which people might know about. So Young Minds and Couth are both online apps that people can have and download and use. Papyrus is a suicide charity or suicide prevention charity. Mind, which I guess is, you know, is the mental health charity. Obviously they work with adults, but also they have young persons advice and things on their website. Self Harm UK, they're a really good organisation actually, and they offer sort of support and group support, and they offer sort of programs for young people. So they do that online, but they're not sort of in a group, they're doing it themselves. And they offer quite a lot of support and resources for you know, professionals who work with young people. So certainly at Relate, we had a talk from them and a session a few years ago, and they were really helpful, informative. So that may be something that you want to follow up for another one of your speakers or something. But their website has a lot of good advice for parents as well, which is always useful. The NHS, obviously, if you Google that, there's lots of mental health support and advice on there. And the NSPCC, again, that's a useful resource. I think if you're ever one area that, you know, might come up is if someone talks about sexual abuse or past sexual abuse. And obviously we've got the safeguarding side with that about, you know, is anybody still at risk? Is that perpetrator still around? But you know, also the young person may be very much saying, well, I'm not going to tell you who it is. I don't want to tell anyone. I don't want anyone to find out. And the NSPCC have quite a lot of good advice and a helpline. And so that would always be somewhere where we would always point somebody in that situation at Relate. We'd say, okay, you know, we're not going to force you to tell us this, because obviously you have to do that at your own pace, but you may find speaking to someone at the NSPCC may be helpful because they have specially trained advisors in that area. Childline, which we all sort of know and remember from Esther Ransom, again, they have, you know, they're very much specialists in speaking to children and young people, and it's a free phone call for them to make. So again, if they want a more anonymous way of seeking help, picking up the phone to Childline can be, you know, an easier way to do that. Zero Suicide Alliance, really good website. I'd absolutely say to anybody here to go on there and go to the training section, and they have a sort of 20-minute training about how to talk to people who are suicidal, and they've got it's broken up into 3 parts. There's one that's a taxi driver who picks someone up in his cab who's suicidal. There's one of a father whose son calls him from university, and there's one of someone who recognises a work colleague is suicidal. And it's just a really, as I say, it's not that long, 20 minutes, half an hour. It's a free training. I think you have to put your postcode in when you're logging into it, but that's all. And they've never sent me loads of emails or anything afterwards. So it's just, I think, so they can see what areas of the country they're reaching. But are really worth doing for anybody, really, just in everyday life. So yeah, I would definitely recommend doing that. Shout and The Mix are both 2 more young persons sort of online things. And the Samaritans that we all know and are aware of, which are, you know, any age. So those, as I say, all those are embedded links. So when you get the PowerPoint, when you click on them, all being well, it should take you to those websites. And then that's the bit of my presentation. If I can move my bar out of the way, I can.
Thank you so much, Dee. That was really, you know,
Yeah.
like quite hard hitting, but
Oh,
very
right.
important subject for all of us working with young people. So yeah, thank you very much.